Welcome to Daily Truths with Dave Ahlman.
Hi, everybody. Today I want to talk about a subject that we rarely talk about in churches or in Bible studies, and that is the subject of fasting. Now, it's interesting in the Old Testament, God's people would fast on the Day of Atonement, according to Leviticus chapter 23. In the book of Esther, God's people were reminded that if they felt like fasting, it was perfectly permissible, and they could do that either individually or as a group. And so today, Jesus picks up on the subject of fasting, knowing that it's something that Jewish people do faithfully and regularly. Now, remember in the Sermon on the Mount, he's been picking on the Pharisees, and he calls them hypocrites. In the Sermon on the Mount, he calls them hypocrites because of the way they pray in public, and they do it for a self-glorification that people might notice and say how pious and honorable they are. He picks on them regarding the giving to the needy, that they oftentimes brag about their giving, and they do it in synagogues and in the public so that other people might say, wow, look at how dedicated and how pious they are. And now he talks about the subject of fasting. And we pick it up in the book of Matthew chapter 6. Again, this is the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus says this in verse 16. You can go ahead and read it at the bottom of the screen with me. And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites. Again, that's the Pharisees, for they disfigure their faces and their fasting so that their fasting may be seen by others. So in other words, they made themselves look gaunt and horrible and like they hadn't eaten for days, and maybe they hadn't, but they emphasized it by making their face look disfigured so that others might say, wow, you guys are dedicated. And again, as Jesus is preaching this, I don't know if any Pharisees were in the crowd, but you can just imagine people nudging each other because they knew exactly who Jesus was talking about. He was ripping on the Pharisees regarding their giving to the needy. He was ripping on the Pharisees regarding their giving and their fasting and prayer. And so he says the very same thing here too. Truly, I say to you, they've received their reward. In other words, the glorification that they get from other people about how pious and holy they are, that's their reward in full. It does them no good otherwise. And then he says in verse 17, but when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face. Now, that's what people did with olive oil on a regular basis. When they'd wash their face, they usually use olive oil. And so he was saying, just practice fasting as part of your regular routine. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting, verse 18, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Wow. So Jesus is saying there, it's perfectly permissible and acceptable for you to go ahead and fast. Now, I want to talk about why we would do fasting today, because it's not absolutely required as a Christian. Then why would we do it? Well, there's 4 different reasons that I want to identify real quickly. First of all, fasting, when we fast, when we say, I'm not going to be eating this meal, we take that time to pray. And that's why we fast. So fasting reminds us that we are to pray during that time. Secondly, it is a regular way to show self-discipline, just as we want to read the scriptures on a regular basis and we want to pray on a regular basis. So fasting on a periodic basis teaches us self-discipline. Okay. Number 3, it reminds us that we can live with a lot less. When we fast, when we miss a meal or 2, maybe during the week, it reminds us that we can live on a lot less. And here in the United States, we have so much. So fasting reminds us we don't need quite so much. We can live on a lot less. And finally, number 4, it helps us appreciate what God has given. When we're fasting, we realize, oh my goodness, God has given me so much, and I thank him for what he's done for me. So this is just straight talk on fasting. Now, let's talk about it practically. Is it something you must do? No. Is it something you can do? Absolutely. Does it mean that you should fast like 4 or 5 times a week? If you've never fasted before, this is what I encourage you to do. For instance, with a swimmer, when somebody's just learning to swim, do you tell them, okay, swim the English Channel now? No, we don't say that. We start in little incremental bits, right? And so it's the same thing with fasting. So looking at those 4 things that fasting does for us, it teaches us self-discipline. It gives us time to think about prayer. helps us realize we don't need quite so much, and it makes us appreciate what God has given. If you want to do fasting on a fairly consistent basis, I would encourage you to start with just one meal a week, right? And then you can build up. If you want to do it more, that's perfectly fine. If you don't want to do it at all, that's perfectly fine. We've already talked about the refining process of fasting and what it does. But again, it's not something you must do. Under the grace of God, under the freedom we have in Christ, it's something you can do, but it's not something you must do. And if it's helpful for you to focus more on Jesus, and I was asking my wife this morning, what do you think about fasting, Beth? What does fasting do for you? And she said, it reminds me to focus my life on Jesus. If fasting helps you do that, then by all means, go ahead and do it. So that's teaching on fasting today. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you have a wonderful day in Jesus Christ. And this is today's daily truth. Have a great day in Jesus Christ.
Thank you for tuning in to Daily Truths with Dave Ahlman. If this ministry is blessing you, please consider supporting us by sharing this channel with a friend. You can also like, comment, subscribe, or leave a review. This helps us tremendously. Come back tomorrow for your next Daily Truth.